We're going to move into the next part of the program, and if you have this notebook with you, I'm going to use that starting on page 15. And I'm going to ask Billy to pass out. While he's doing that, I want to introduce him. The board of directors met last year and decided that maybe we would get some help in the General Assembly. I would, by having someone to just, sometimes you just have to have someone show up at a meeting and monitor what's going on. And after the committee takes a position, Billy would represent us, and he was provided compliments of Virginia Beach. Sheriff Stolley assigned him to the Sheriff's Association during the General Assembly, and we really appreciated it. He worked right out of our office, stayed downtown Richmond, and he was a big help. There were a lot of times if a senator or somebody would call and say, I need something, and I'm on the way to the committee, or can you bring me my talk, can you develop and bring talking points, and I need them on the floor. I can develop and I'd give them to Billy and he'd run them down, and I didn't have to do it. I had a lot of help, and it was very much appreciated. So Billy's going to be here when I talk about some of these bills, and I wanted you to meet him. So with that, we'll just walk through some of these bills and how the process worked. If you look on page 16, there were 2,720 bills introduced in the General Assembly. And the way those works is the bills get introduced, they start to get pre-filed, and what our job is to look at each bill and see if it affects sheriffs. And if it does affect sheriffs, either good or bad, or if I think it might affect sheriffs, then I'll pull the bill and we would send it to the legislative committee for a review. So we pulled a lot of bills this year, and every morning you get up and you look at all the bills that gets introduced, and by 10, 11 o'clock, the legislative committee starts getting emails with bills to vote on. So we voted on 111 items, bills, and sometimes you vote more than once. Send a bill out, the committee may say, we don't like it. And the way this works is we do what the committee votes. And you know, we had this discussion last year on a bill relating to fees. Some sheriffs liked it, what we did, some sheriffs didn't like it, but what we do is a vote of the committee. And so if it's overwhelming in favor or against, that's what we're going to do. We have to have an organization and a system, and that's what we use. So the committee would vote on bills, we would do our thing on it, go to the legislature, appear before the committee, and do blast to you all, and you would call. Sometimes a bill would get amended, and I wasn't sure if it was amended good enough, and we'd sometimes send bills back out. So the committee did a lot of work. It was, being on the legislative committee is pretty important. So the next, I don't know if I can do this, let me see. There's your legislative committee, the members that are on it, and they were getting bills every morning for about 6 weeks. Sometimes 5 or 6 would come in. So these are the bills that were voted on and the status of them. A lot of them passed. I don't think anything passed that we didn't really have an influence on. If we didn't like the bill, we either fixed it or killed it. So now I'm going to look at the actual bills in your notebook, and I don't know if you have the notebook, but I'm going to be on page 20. I'm not going to stop and explain all of these bills. I'm going to go over them quickly, and you might want to make a note to look at it, but the first one I'm going to talk about is not in the notebook. It's the one Billy just passed out, and it has to do with training for elected officials. So you need to look at this because you have to do something. If you look at that one sheet that Billy just passed out, at the beginning it says, each elected official shall complete training. And it has to do with the Ethics Council, and the Ethics Council is going to provide the training, but you have to do it. Now flip over and look on the back. At the bottom, you want to take this one home and make sure you know what to do. If you're holding office on July the 1st, 2019, you shall complete the training by December the 31st. So everyone here that's a sheriff now, and you're gonna, continue in office, you have to complete this training, and it'll be provided by the Ethics Council. So that's a pretty important thing. Do not do that. Okay, I'm gonna walk through some of these bills on page 20. Senate Bill 1644 simply talks about sharing information on people with mental health treatment. It's self-explanatory, and I'm not going to go into details. I'm just pointing out these are some of the bills that were voted on by the committee, and some of the bills look like, well, why are we even looking at it? The reason it was in this notebook is because some of these bills may have been a lot worse and they had damaging language in it, and we were able to take the language out. So what you're seeing may be the final product of what originated as a bad bill, but we put them in here anyway because it was in our system. The same thing with the next bill, 1671, talks about the Central Criminal Records Exchange. The next bill is on page 24 on parking ordinances, and it talks about localities can use uniform personnel on parking ordinances. The next one talks about consent, and this bill is House Bill 2494, and it talks about government data collection and dissemination of information on religious preferences. And if you look down near the bottom, the italicized language is new, and it adds to the list of people that have to provide information, and you can't provide information to the government based on religious beliefs, and that's what that's saying. And there were 2 or 3 bills just like this, and we'll see them later on. We won't go into them and talk about them necessarily because we're talking about it now, but it relates to providing information on religious preferences. The next bill is House Bill 2546, and it relates to establishing maternal death review team, and what the review team will do. And look over on page 8 of that bill. Is the real language, page 8 and 9, and the team shall consist of, so you're going to have fatality review teams, and they shall consist of, and it talks about local law enforcement. So that's why I have this here. And on the next page, it talks about maternal death and records regarding death, and it brings in local and state law enforcement agencies. And the medical examiner will be working with folks on it to establish those teams. The next bill, 2576, gives DCJS something extra to do, creating a sex trafficking response coordinator. That was a hot item in the General Assembly, and that's one of the bills that passed relating to that. 1598, I'm on page 38, talks about the establishment of minimum standards for jails relating to health, and the Board of Corrections will establish minimum standards for jails. Now, you may remember 2 years ago, the Board of Corrections was changed. There were people taken off of it. It was reorganized, and they were to establish and review deaths. And this is a continuation of that project, where they will now establish minimum standards for jails on health care services. And there's an exemption for those jails that are accredited by the American Correctional Association and the National Commission on Health Care. So know that you will be hearing more about that. The next bill in the notebook, page 39, we've already discussed it. It's a duplicate. The next bill is one of those bills that started off something we didn't want, about restraint for pregnant prisoners. We had a real fight on this about when Sheriff Arthur was president, and we went through the whole process. We had these advocates coming to the General Assembly by the hundreds, lining up in a committee, demonizing sheriffs because we held down and chained women while they were having babies. And that was a testimony. And one person after another got up and said that. And they produced so-called witnesses. And they said they had gone through that. And it was just, we got a bad rap on it. We worked pretty hard that year and got all of it referred to the Board of Corrections. And they had hearings all summer long, the year Beth and Sheriff Crawford was there. And we went in, and the advocates came into the Board of Corrections, and then all of a sudden the light came on, and they realized they'd been had. There's this national organization, and they're going around the country, and they're getting legislators to do this, and they put these bills in, then they'd invite them into their conference, give them the award, and they'd run on it that they saved all these pregnant prisoners. That's what was happening, and when you got up to testify for the bill, you had these people with a microphone and a camera right in your face, and they tried to demonize us to no extent. But we prevailed, and it ended up with jail standards that were quite reasonable. So that was about to happen again. You got an election coming up, had a senator to put a bill in that says we're going through this whole process again. And we were able to go to the senator and said, listen, we've already done this. There's not an issue. If you want to take a bill home, we rewrote it. This is what I wrote. He agreed to it, and that's what passed. All it says, basically, and it's not a bad bill, it says the Board of Corrections will review it and see if it's working, and if it is, fine. So that's what that is on page 40. The next bill, and for you that have regional jails, is 1878. That bill extends the same benefit to regional jails, or the same authority to regional jails on the administration of naloxone to people in jail. Regional jails couldn't do it. Sheriffs can, because we're certified law enforcement officers as defined in 9.1-101, and regional jail officers are not, so they were excluded. So they needed this bill so regional jails could do that, which was necessary. The next bill is House Bill 1918 on page 46, and this is a duplicate. We just talked about it a while ago. Medical standards. There was a bill put in the House. There was a bill put in the Senate. Both the same. They both passed, and that's a duplicate. The next bill is on page 47. Relates to medical and mental health treatment for prisoners incapable of giving consent, and allows you, there's a mechanism now to provide services if they're incapable of giving consent. So those of you that run jails or in your regional jails, you might want to look at that. The next bill was a bill we didn't like, and it was proposed by a sheriff, but it was it was kind of a sleeper in the bill that years ago, when we created workforces, the General Assembly decided that the only people they wanted working inmates in the community were sheriffs. They didn't want regional jails doing it because sheriffs are more responsive. They're elected by the people in the community. And in this situation, the sheriff had agreed to let the regional jail do the work for us, and we stepped in and said, wait a minute, this probably goes a little bit too far. You don't want regional jail people working folks in a workforce in your community. So we worked out a language, and this is how the legislative process is supposed to work. If you look at the last page, it says they work under the supervision of the sheriff or his designee. And if the sheriff wants to designate a regional jail person to do it, they can do it. If not, the sheriff maintain control on it. So the next item is the exchange of, this is on page 51, and it's House Bill 1942. This was medical and mental health information and records in local jails and state prisons. And there's a work group. That's important. If you're interested in serving in any of these work groups, you can let us know. But on page 53 at the end, it talks about how the Board of Corrections shall convene a work group consisting of sheriffs, superintendents of correctional facilities, and a lot of other folks. And so we'll be involved in that. Now, I'm bringing this up so that in case someone wants to participate, they can. Next bill, House Bill 2213, adds local probation officers to those that can receive information, record information. You get it in your jailers, law enforcement officers, now local probation officers can receive that information. That's on page 54. All right, let's see, this next one is, simply purchase of handguns. In the past, if you had a deputy to retire and he wanted to purchase his handgun, it had to be with the approval from the local governing body. That language was stricken. So if you have a deputy to retire and he wants to purchase his service weapon, you can approve it. This next bill on page 57 simply adds rabbis and priests. They cannot withhold information when they come across it on child abuse. And there are some exceptions, but that was added to the code. Juvenile intake officers relate. I'm on page 59. Senate Bill 1381 relates to juvenile intake officers required to transport. Now, if you get an order and there's an appeal and to a school division, it adds death threats and school threats, and that the operative language is a threat pursuant to 18.260, which is a threat of a family member, and it relates to information to juvenile intake officers. The next bill is Senate Bill 1416. I'm on page 63. It talks about if there is an appeal from a local Department of Social Services and there's an appeal and there's a criminal investigation, the criminal investigation is going to take precedent and the appeal will be stayed. So you need to know that if you've got something going on with social services. The next bill, 1501, attracted a lot of attention in the General Assembly. It was introduced by Senator Carrico. Mandatory life in prison for anyone that shoots. I mean, you got the death penalty, but in the way those went out in the General Assembly, the State Police Association had 5 widows of troopers that had been murdered, and it was very compelling. And when you go for a penalty bill like this, they're really tough to get passed, but they did a good job with convincing the General Assembly to do the minimum mandatory of life. In one case, there was a person that had killed a trooper, and he's going to be out. I mean, he didn't get life, he didn't get death, and didn't get life, and he's going to be back out. So you have all the lawyers, you have the ACLU, you have everybody opposing this kind of stuff, but that was a compelling testimony from 5 widows of troopers that stood up before that committee and told their story, and they didn't dare vote against it. However, when it went to the governor, the ACLU wrote a letter to the governor and asked him to veto it, and he didn't. The next bill is on page 67, and it relates to drones. It adds another exception where you don't have to go through the process. You can use a drone to generally survey a residence subject to a warrant. And you can use a drone if you've got a hot pursuit going on. And about, I guess, 7 or 8 years ago, the ACLU put in all these bills about we can't use drones because it violates so many constitutional rights. We were able to kill those bills, and for a while, no one could use a drone for anything because we just said we're not going to agree to it. And finally, we came up and agreed to language that allowed law enforcement to use drones under certain circumstances, and now we're kind of edging away at it. So that was another, and there may be more in the future. All right, killing or injuring a police animal. That was a bill that passed. They killed the bill in the House. A Senate bill came over. I believe it was Senator Reeves' bill. Passed the Senate, came over to the same committee, and they passed it. And I know Spotsylvania was there, and a lot of folks were there. We had supported that bill when it went through the House the first time. We were able to get it passed, and it's a mandatory minimum of 6 months for people to kill a police animal. Let's see, the next one, 1953, is the same as one I've already discussed. All right, now, you may remember a lot of media coverage last summer and last fall about how Virginia has so many more evictions than all these other states. And it was based on a study from some college, and I don't remember which one, out of New York, somewhere in the Northeast. And it just painted a pretty bad picture about Virginia having all of these evictions. Well, they didn't ask the sheriffs about it. They just came out with all the publicity and said, oh, we're going to fix this problem. We said, well, wait a minute. The data is showing that a conviction order was gotten, but it was never really carried out because the person paid or he got worked out with the landlord. And really, we were doing less than 50% of what was reported. Well, you had all of the people running for the House and Senate and everything else that said that we're going to solve the world's problems, and this is one of them. So they got that bill passed, and here it is on page 74, and it basically changes the name of it from a writ to an order of eviction, and it makes a few other changes. So they did listen to us, and we were able to convince them that we're not as bad off as you think. All right, now the next bill is on page 83. It was put in by Delegate Aird of Petersburg. And this bill has a little bit of a history. She put the bill in that said if there's going to be a child custody case, the petitioner could have law enforcement present. The court could say, you got to be there. Well, can you imagine what that would do? All these child custody cases anywhere. I mean, not at the courthouse, but maybe at the home, or maybe at the northern end of the county. And then you got 4 coming up Monday, and you got to have these deputies running everywhere to deal with it. So we went to Delegate Aird, and in the very beginning, she was very cooperative. We proposed several changes. And when he got to committee, she really didn't like any of these changes. And so the bill came out of committee in a bad way for me, for you. And, you know, it got to it had passed the House, and there was so much going on, it passed like 100 to nothing. And then I'm looking at it, and Sheriff Dempsey had a conference call with the legislative committee to review all these bills, and we did a pretty good job of keeping, but this bill had come through. One of the sheriffs on the conference call said, where's that bill about these child custody cases? And I looked at it and I'm going, all right, this bill's passed the House, but we can't let it get out the way it is. So we got on it in the Senate and ended up, then it gets out of the Senate committee, Courts of Justice, and it wasn't in good shape. So Senator Obenshain took it on. I went to see him. I said, look, we can't live with this. He said, I know. What do you want to do? And I said, we'll do a floor amendment to fix it. And this is the floor amendment. And we can live with the floor amendment. It basically says what we're doing now. So kudos for Senator Obenshain. And I know Delegate Aird was offended a little bit. She thinks we gutted her bill, and we did, really. But that was a legislative process. We just couldn't live with it. Now, I'm going to move on. The next bill is on page 84. 2585 changes the uniform car markings, and it struck all that language that was done back in the 70s to allow sheriffs to do pretty much what they want on their automobiles. And the only other thing we ought to do is probably abolish the whole thing. This code section was put in back in the 60s. Now, I wasn't here in the 60s and doing this job, but it was in the 60s. We researched it one time and found out the state used to pay for the cars. They used to pay mileage. And over the years, when the budgets got cut, they cut out the mileage. They cut out everything other than what we're getting. But the General Assembly back then wanted all the sheriff's cars to look alike. And those of you that have been around a while, you remember they were brown and top and had the seal on the back, and they all looked alike. And then when a deputy from another jurisdiction comes over and does something crazy in your jurisdiction, you're the one that got the call on it. And it wasn't one of your deputies, but the people thought it was. So we tinkered with the code back then and changed it, and you could put different colors in cars, and you all have been doing that. So Todd Gilbert fixed it a little bit more. And I was talking to Todd about it. Maybe we just need to do away with all of it, and maybe we'll take a look at that later. So that bill passed, but it relates to your car markings. It gives you relief. You don't have to do all of it. Now, the next bill was a bill from DCJS, I believe, or it was an administration bill. Senate Bill 1130, and it talks about school security officers, resource officers, and talks about how they get certified and recertified serving as resource officers. And this bill sort of interfered with our Stafford bill that Delegate Thomas put in. I'm going to talk about that in detail in just a minute. It was finally vetoed, but this was one of the bills, and I think the reason they vetoed it does say that every school board shall ensure that and this is the last page on the bill, each school board shall ensure that every public school that supervises employs at least one school administrator who has completed, either in person or online, a school safety training program. So your school administrator has to do that, and it's offered by the Virginia Center for School and Campus Safety. All right, so I'm going to get into that a little bit more when you're talking about that other bill. Some of these bills are duplicates of bills I've already talked about. All right, on page 97, talks about development of review crisis, emergency management, medical response plans, and there are going to be teams on that, and law enforcement's involved in the teams, so you might want to look at that on page 98. You maybe get contacted to participate in participating in one of those teams. Now let's talk about a bill that passed that we had an impact on. House Bill 2609 was Delegate Jay Jones's bill. It was a youth commission bill. So when this bill was introduced, like all the other bills, I sent it out to the legislative committee. They didn't like the bill. The legislative committee said, well, we don't like the bill because we can't have a school resource officer unless they're trained by the Center for School Resource. Well, what if they don't get around to training them? Is someone going to say, you can't send your officer into school, or if you send your officer into school and he makes an arrest, is the defense attorney going to say, well, he wasn't certified by the Virginia Center? So we testified against the bill, and the first committee killed it. Then the bill came back up again, and it was a little bit better. It was a little bit more in shape with this, but it wasn't perfect, so I talked to Delegate Jones, and that was when the law enforcement certification issue was bringing its head up. And we thought the bill was amended to include Title 9.101, which is the duties of DCJS, and then it brought in the certification of law enforcement. So that's when we went to Senator Stanley and said, well, let's fix this bill and let's put a floor amendment on it that says, and I've got the floor amendment, I want to talk about it a little bit. The department, being DCJS, shall grant certification pursuant to 15.2, 1706 for any law enforcement officer after completion of such required training. They shall do it. There's no free ride. You got to do the required training. That didn't change. And 1701 is the required training for law enforcement, jail, the minimum standards, and that's in the notebook. So it did not strip any training. It did not allow anyone to take a shortcut. It did not allow you not to do training. It just said that once your officer does the training, the sheriff now certifies that the deputy has completed it. And if you certify, that's the end of it. DCJS has got to grant the certification to the law enforcement. It didn't say deputy sheriffs that are jailers are going to now be certified law enforcement officers. It didn't say that. It says everybody that gets certified as law enforcement, the same rules apply that apply now. It's just DCJS doesn't certify, you certify. So we talked to some of the sheriffs about it, and this bill had problems anyway. And I talked to Senator Stanley about it, and Bryce Reeves, he used to be an officer. He said, that's a great idea. Talked to people in the governor's office. They thought it was a good idea. So we put it in, and it flew through the Senate 40-0. Then it was like the bombshell hits. You know, the Chiefs of Police Association wasn't involved in any of this, and I think they're a little bit offended now. Here's all of this happening, and it affected them. The chief would have to certify too. and their lobbyists didn't know anything about it. But if you have the notebook, look on page 107. And this is where the idea came from. You get pay raises if your sheriff certifies. This is in the Appropriations Act. The Compensation Board approves live scan. A letter is needed from the sheriff. That's a form of certification. If you do not certify, I'm down on number 3. If the sheriff does not certify, you do not get funding from the Master Deputy Program. You have to certify that you're getting it. The next example, effective July 16, the Compensation Board is authorized to withhold payment to the locality for sheriff's law enforcement expenses if the sheriff fails to certify certain things. So certification, there's one more on the next page. To ensure funding, this relates to the police. The police have to annually certify to DCJS to get 599 funding. So certification means something. And I know this was probably 15 years ago, another constitutional officer certified that he had completed the training on the master, whatever, it was commissioner or treasurer or whatever. They certified they had completed the training. Their salary went up by 10%. At that time, it was more than $200. It was a felony. And there you go. He loses his office or gets convicted of a felony. Certification is pretty important. It carries a lot of weight. So there's nothing better than certifying that your deputy has completed the training. It's probably the strongest type of governing that you can do. You're not going to certify that you've done something, and now if you get more than $500 for it, you've committed a felony. There's nothing stronger than that. So we put the language in on certification, and you should have seen the storm. And well, you did see it, some of you, that came out saying, well, this is awful. Sheriffs are trying to strip training. And actually, it would have gone the other way. It would have strengthened the training. But anyway, by the time an amendment passed the Senate and got back to the House, Delegate Jones had originally said, yeah, I'm good with the amendment. And by the time he got back, he stood up. All he would have had to do was stand up and accept it, and it would have gone on to the governor. He didn't do that. The conference committee took that out, and it didn't pass. But it's not a bad idea. And just let me tell you, I was going around lobbying it. These are the last 2 days. I think Billy had already gone home. And I was talking to the Senate. I think I need to do it in the Senate because that's where we got to originate it. And the patrons already agreed to it. So if I'm weak anywhere to be in the Senate, I went around and lobbied. Even Carrico voted for it. Everybody, 40 senators voted for it. I go to see Lionel Spruill, walk around in the offices. I explained it to him. I said, some of these deputies are not being certified. They work primarily in the jail, but they are being trained in law enforcement, and they're sitting in the same academy as a police officer, but DCJS is not certifying them. Senator Spruill looked at me and he said, do they certify game wardens? I said, yeah. He said, don't say no more. I'm with you. I'm going to vote for it. If they can certify a game warden as law enforcement, they certainly ought to be certifying deputy sheriff that's been trained. And so that was it. Long story short on it, that got to the highest level, the governor. I talked to him about it, and some other sheriffs talked to him about it. When the bill didn't pass, he pretty much took charge, and it's fixed. I think it's fixed with DCJS, and we're trying to get them to send out something, but that's been like pulling hen's teeth. So that was a story that's a little bit different than what was sent out by a lot of folks, but that's what happened with the bill. There was no one else really lobbying it. No one else was down to General Assembly. Everybody else had gone home. And when you explain it to people, they go, well, that's a pretty good idea. All right, now the next bill, page 109, House Bill 2721, talks about people that are previously employed can be school security officers. Keep that thought in mind, previously employed by a law enforcement agency in the United States. Just hold that thought for a little while, and I'm going to talk about it again when we get to the bills that was vetoed. Now, that's all the bills I'm going to talk about. that passed. I want to talk about some resolution. I got something for Billy to pass out. This is a resolution. It should have gotten in the notebook because that on page 114, there's a commending resolution for the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office. And you can read the resolution. It talks about many of the things that Loudoun County Sheriff's Office has done. It rose to the level of Senator Black and Delegate LaRock and Senator Boysko putting a bill in. And so that's ought to be noted. And congratulations, Mike. And we can present that resolution at the annual meeting or up in your area or whenever they want to do it. The next one is a commending resolution for Sheriff Dempsey. And his delegate thinks the world of Sheriff Dempsey. She put this in, and Margaret did, and Richard Stewart, Margaret Ransom, Delegate Ransom put this in, and Richard Stewart, and it passed. And the one that's being passed around is a resolution commending Stanley Clark. He's retired. Actually, Stanley, is he still with us? He came to the meeting. He didn't want to leave us. Stanley's still in it. I don't know if he's here or not. But Stanley had a commending resolution, and I'm sure that will be presented to him at the appropriate time. So now, let's talk for a little bit about some of these bills that were vetoed. And the first one's on page 117. It was a pretty simple bill. We didn't really get involved in those. It says, no locality shall adopt an ordinance, procedure, or policy intended to restrict the enforcement of federal immigration laws. It wasn't one of our favorites. The legislative committee had a mix, and I knew what was going to happen to it, so I didn't use up any credits lobbying for or against it. And then the governor vetoed it, and the veto was sustained. Now, the next one deserves a little bit of discussion. It's on page 118. This is a bill introduced by Senator Carrico, Senate Bill 1521. And when the bill was introduced and went through, I saw the bill and we didn't get involved in it. It looked like a state police bill. It looked like their radar bill. And I didn't think it was a big deal until the news stories start coming out on it. And then if you really read it, which I should have done in the beginning, and we should have killed it when it went through the General Assembly, and we didn't. So now we're at a point of this thing's passed, and it's on the governor's desk, and I talked to Sheriff Dempsey. He gave me guidance, and he said, well, see if you can kill it now. And if you have your notebook, I want you to look at the bottom of page 118. And it says the state police may operate the handheld speed monitoring device in these work zones, and a handheld photo speed monitoring device may be used only by a law enforcement officer employed by the Department of State Police. Okay, so they're being treated differently. You know something special is coming. And it comes down in the later paragraph, and it says 10% of the proceeds go to the state police budget. It says all the proceeds go to the state police budget, up to 10% of their budget. So I pulled at the state budget. Their budget's $335 million, roughly. So the state police now are going to get all this money, up to $35 million. And the whole thing was sold on how dangerous it is going through speed zones and work zones. So I remember in 2012, Delegate Todd Gilbert put a bill in for the state police that said all, not part, but all of the proceeds from tickets written by state police have to go to the literary fund. Not us. Local warrants, you know what happens. We got that back. McCauley put an amendment in a year or two ago and we got it passed. So we got all that money back. But all state funds, tickets written on state warrants by state agencies, all the money has to go to the literary fund. This bill didn't change that. So then I was talking through email to Sheriff Gardner, who's on on the legislative committee, and those of you that serve on the legislative committee, you might not think so, but when you put those comments, it's very important. And he's telling me about how bad this thing worked out down in Tennessee, where you got a camera sitting there. State police don't have to be operating it. They got to be within 100 feet, okay? You're going through. If you're more than 12 miles over, it's going to take a picture and automatically send you the ticket. And then when the motorist gets upset, they're not going to know the difference between a trooper and a deputy. They're going to know they went through the speed zone. Nobody stopped them. And they get this ticket. Could be your kid on the car. It's just a bad deal. So we went into the governor's office. I went in and talked to the people there and talked to the governor and said, this is a bad deal. Kill this bill. Veto it. And he's looking at it. No, I said 100 feet. I think it's 1,000 feet. That's a pretty good distance. So the trooper can be sitting over working, doing whatever. And these people are going through getting these automatic tickets. Anyway, we asked the governor to veto it. And he didn't veto it, but he did something just as good. He put a reenactment clause on it. So the bill doesn't take effect unless it's reenacted. That's pretty much killing it. It's not going to take effect. It's got to pass the General Assembly again. And I'm not going to let this one slide if it comes up again. Senator Carrico is not running again. So I don't know if he's going to put it in or who will put it in. I know he won't. But there are a couple of problems with it. One is if you're going to treat one law enforcement group one way, don't single out one group and treat them any differently. And the other thing that comes to mind here, how come we don't get some of those contracts in these work zones? And maybe we need to start looking at that. It's a lot of money involved in that. So now that's going to be looked at. What the governor did was say, okay, it doesn't pass until it's reenacted, and it won't become effective. It's got to be reenacted by the 2020 session of the General Assembly. And this is pretty important, the Secretary of Public Safety and Homeland Security, in consultation with the Virginia State Police, the Virginia Sheriff's Association, and the Virginia Association of Chiefs of Police, shall review the proposed, and this is cut off, but basically we got to have a work group and review all of this to see where the money is going. And if we put this back in, we're going to be at the table, and we ought to be getting some of that work zone money. It's been a monopoly for years. All right, so that's enough about that. The next one I want to talk about is Governor vetoed it over our objection, was the school protection bill. Sheriff Decatur in Stafford put a bill in. He had Richard Stewart and Delegate Thomas to put a bill in, same bill. And all it said was instead of hiring security guards, you're going to hire them as retired officers, deputy sheriffs, make them deputy sheriffs. And they're not going to be school resource officers. It's going to be for the elementary and secondary school, and they're going to guard the door. They're going to guard the perimeter. They are school protection officers. And you're going to use those people that are retired law enforcement. And DCJS is supposed to set the training standards. Well, they didn't like any of that. And remember the thing I said, hold the thought on? The governor vetoed this bill because he said, well, if you read the statement, it's not defined. Well, it's pretty well defined. You know what school protection means. And DCJS pressured the governor and the secretary into vetoing our bill. And when he was here the other morning, he mentioned this and said he was willing to work with us. And so we ought to go back and maybe take another shot at it. But one of the things they said in the veto statement was, it doesn't say that these officers have to be Virginia officers. We'll go back to the bill. I said, hold your thought on it. That bill that he did sign under school resource officers said they can be U.S. officers from anywhere in the country. So that's a little bit of inconsistency there. We objected to it. I wanted to show you a clip from Delegate Thomas, what he said on the floor. He wasn't too happy with DCJS. Neither were we. And we'll be back, put the bill in. You can't get mad with the governor because he's the governor. He's going to write the budget coming up. He did do some of the other stuff we wanted, so you kind of use the runway in front of you, not the runway behind you when you're doing it. And he vetoed another bill, and that's on page 128. This was an important bill for the sheriffs that run jails. You got ICE, you got inmates. The sheriff, when the inmate's released, do you notify them early, or do you not notify ICE? And you get in trouble no matter what you do, because you got advocates on both sides. You got people beating on your door telling you need to lock up these these people. And then you got the other folks saying, notify ICE and take them away. And then you got the others saying, no, don't cooperate. So all this bill said was, it took the monkey off our back and said, we notify ICE as soon as we know when they're going to get released. That's simple. Just notify ICE. They can do what they want to do, but it takes it off our back, and the sheriffs could have gone to their community and said, we're following the law. Governor vetoed that bill. And, you know, when you have a General Assembly that's so close, it takes 2/3 to override it. That's not going to happen. So with that, it concludes my presentation. I want you to meet Billy. Billy, a lot of these bills we're not even presenting because we testified and they killed them. Well, I'm not going to present many dead bills, but Billy was able to go, and I don't know if you want to add anything, but he was very good help.
I did more than just pass stuff out. I did some other things, but it gave me an opportunity to see how the process works and how really one person, I had the opportunity to get information from John Jones, from the sheriffs, through the website, and I was able to either support or not support legislation. And it was a great opportunity. I thank the sheriff in Virginia Beach for giving me that opportunity. I kept thinking, how am I going to explain my job up there? Well, John started giving me tasks. Here, pass this out, pass this out. And that's what I did for about 6 weeks. I met a lot of outstanding people. I got to get our point across, our profession, the things that are important to us. And 9 times out of 10, the legislators were very receptive, and they wanted to make the city or the state a safer place. They wanted to make our profession better for everyone. And I'm just thankful for that, and I look forward to doing it again.
You know he's doing a good job when the chairman of the committee knows him by name. And the Courts of Justice Criminal Committee is the most time-consuming committee, and they want somebody from the Sheriff's Association in that room. When that bill comes up, the committee had already voted. They want to hear what we think about it. And Billy would just get up and say, we support it, and tell them why, or we're against it and tell them why. Most of the time they agreed with us, sometimes they didn't. But that meant I didn't have to sit in there, and I could get out in the lobby and do some other things and work with other legislators and other things. And so he was a big help. And I really appreciate him being there, and I appreciate Sheriff Stolley assigning him. So with that, we'll move on and ask Sheriff Leonard to come up and present the next speaker. And I would say one thing Billy did while he's on the way up, these marijuana decriminalization laws, he testified against those. And the General Assembly killed every one of them. But I tell you what, we're going to have to be worried about that. There are a lot of lobbyists trying to push that stuff through. And the money is getting behind it now. They got stocks market. If you look at some of these, the Motley Fool, for example, you know, the thing in the newspaper, but what stock to buy, they're telling you to buy marijuana. Companies are dealing with marijuana. So when your money gets behind it, we may have to deal with it more. We need to kill these bills. They're terrible bills, some of them. You don't want people operating machinery and buses and trains and all that. I could go off on them, but Carl, thank you.